This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are products of the imagination. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental. Chimam. They said Duke Cassian Blackthorne had never smiled at a funeral because funerals implied something had surprised him. Nothing surprised him. He had arranged too many of them. What happens when the one man every lord in the kingdom fears meets the one woman who never learned to? Stay until the end. What comes next will change how you think about power forever. The prisoner they dragged through the gates of Ravencroft Castle that morning did not look like someone who had just dismantled 3 men's careers and survived. She looked like a woman who was deciding whether to be angry about the mud on her boots. Cassian Blackthorne watched her from the upper gallery, the long stone walkway that ran above the main courtyard like a jaw-clenching, and said nothing while his head of court security, a man named Aldrich, who had survived 17 years in this position by never once blinking at the wrong moment, gave his report beside him. The words came in proper order. Female subject, seamstress by trade, identified irregularities in the supply records for the northern garrison. Approached 3 separate court officials before any of them understood what she was doing. By the time the third man realized she had documentation, actual documentation, physical ledgers she had apparently been collecting across 14 months, the damage was already done. 2 of those officials were Cassian's men. One of them had been his father's man before him. Aldrich finished his report. Then he waited, because that was what Aldrich did. He had learned patience the way some men learn to swim, by being thrown into deep water repeatedly until the instinct to panic became something else. Below, the woman looked up. Not at the castle, not at the guards who flanked her, or the stone arch of the portcullis, or any of the architectural testimony to Blackthorne power that surrounded her on 3 sides. She looked up at the gallery. At him. She could not have known with certainty he was there. The angle was wrong, the morning light falling from the east at a cut that put the gallery in shadow. But she looked directly at where he stood, and her expression did not change into the thing he was accustomed to seeing on the faces of people who suddenly realized they were looking at the Duke of Ravencroft. It did not go white. It did not go careful. She held his gaze, or the space where she assumed his gaze was, for approximately 3 seconds, then looked away as though she had assessed the architecture and found it structurally acceptable. "What is her name?" Cassian said. "Evelyn Ashcroft, Your Grace. 24 years of age, originally from Thornmere, the southeastern village district, moved to the capital quarter of the duchy 8 years ago, established a small tailoring shop on Merchants Row. No criminal record, no prior contact with court authorities." "Why Thornmere?" Aldrich paused 1 beat, the pause of a man who understood that questions without obvious answers were tests in disguise. Her father was a district ledger keeper, small administrative post. He died when she was 16. She came north to support herself. A ledger keeper's daughter. Cassian said nothing more for a moment. He watched one of the guards say something to Evelyn Ashcroft that was probably a command, probably involving movement and direction, and she responded in a way that was technically compliance but structured exactly like an argument, body angled forward slightly, head at a fraction too much elevation. The kind of posture that said, "I am doing what you asked, but I want to be clear that I chose to." "Bring her to the study," he said, "not the receiving hall." Aldrich absorbed this without comment. The receiving hall was theater. The study was real. That distinction communicated something to Aldrich that he would spend the walk down 3 flights of stairs trying to interpret. Cassian let him try. Sick. The study smelled of cold stone and old paper and the particular kind of quiet that accumulates in a room where nothing comfortable ever happened. There was a desk, massive, dark oak, built during his grandfather's tenure and capable of surviving anything short of a structural collapse, and 2 chairs arranged across from it that were technically for visitors but had been chosen specifically for being slightly lower than Cassian's own seat. A small asymmetry, a persistent one. He was reading a dispatch when they brought her in. He did not look up. This was deliberate, and she would know it was deliberate, and knowing that was itself information about where they both stood. He had learned this from his father, who had learned it from his. The person who waits controls the temperature of every room they enter. He gave it 40 seconds. Then he closed the dispatch, set it down with exactness, and looked at her. She was looking at his bookshelves, not in the wandering, nervous way of someone seeking somewhere to rest their eyes. She was reading the spines. Specifically, she appeared to be reading the section on Northern Duchy taxation law and economic reform, a collection of volumes that no one in the last 12 years had touched for any reason other than to dust them. The guards had withdrawn to positions flanking the door. The room was otherwise empty. "Sit down," Cassian said. "I'll stand, thank you." The air in the room changed the way air changed before lightning. One of the guards shifted weight almost imperceptibly. Aldrich, positioned slightly behind and to Cassian's right, did not move at all. But Cassian could feel him recalculating the actuarial likelihood of his continued employment. Cassian studied Evelyn Ashcroft without expression. She was not particularly remarkable in the way that court women were trained to be remarkable. No particular theater to her appearance, no studied arrangement. Brown hair that had escaped whatever she'd tied it back with during what had evidently been an eventful morning. Dress that had once been respectable and was now comprehensively ruined by the kind of day that involved being apprehended. She was slight in frame, but stood in a way that occupied space deliberately, weight-balanced and set, like someone who had decided a long time ago that she was going to take up exactly as much room as she needed and not apologize for it. Her hands were still. That was the detail he noticed most. People brought before him at this desk had restless hands. Fingers working, nails pressing into palms, the small motor betrayals of fear. Her hands were folded in front of her with the specific stillness of a woman who had decided that she was the least frightening thing in this room and was managing accordingly. "That was not a request," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm still standing." A silence passed between them that was, by all measurable criteria, too long to be comfortable. "You exposed 2 of my court officials," he said finally, one of whom held his post for 11 years. "You did this by presenting documentation that you collected across the better part of a year and a half, using access to records that you should not have had, acquired through methods that your file describes only as unspecified." He paused. "Explain the unspecified methods." She looked at him directly. Her eyes were a particular shade of dark gray-green that he would have described as the color of the northern sea during autumn if he were the kind of man who described things that way, which he was not. "I did laundry," she said. The silence that followed this was of a different quality. "You did laundry," he repeated. "Domestic staff at the court administrative offices. I took the work on the side 3 years ago. The seamstress shop slows in winter. Nobles stop ordering new garments when they're worried about their coal supply. The extra income helped." She said this without inflection or apology. People don't pay attention to laundresses. They leave things in pockets. They talk while their clothing is being handled as though the person handling it is part of the furniture. Something moved in her expression, not quite contempt, but adjacent to it. "Your officials in particular talked a great deal. And you listened. I'm not deaf. You're also not a court investigator, an authorized auditor, or anyone with legal standing to collect evidence related to duchy administrative matters." "No," she agreed. "I'm a seamstress, which is apparently why it took me 14 months instead of 14 days. Cassian looked at her for another moment. The thing he was feeling was not precisely what he would have called anger. It was something with more architecture to it, a kind of compressed attention, the sensation that occurred when a situation proved more structurally interesting than expected. He had felt it twice in the last 5 years. Once facing a flood that threatened the northern levees in a configuration that his engineers had declared impossible, and once reading a letter from an allied duchy that contained, embedded in what appeared to be routine diplomatic correspondence, a thread of such specific and elegant construction that he'd had to read it 3 times to confirm he was interpreting it correctly. "Why?" he said, and meant the entire question. Why this? Why her? Why the specific act of gathering evidence against men who could, and likely would have destroyed her if she had miscalculated by any margin at all? She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of hesitation. The quiet of deciding how much of the real answer to give. "Because Aldrin Voss," she said finally, naming one of the officials, "has been diverting a percentage of the garrison supply budget for 4 years. That's coin that was meant to keep soldiers fed and their equipment maintained. Her jaw set, a small movement controlled. My brother was in the northern garrison for 2 years. He came home with a knee that never healed right from equipment failure on a patrol that should have been standard. He walks with a cane now. He's 21 years old. She paused. Someone decided that the difference between adequate equipment and what actually got delivered was worth more to them than the consequences. I thought someone should disagree. Something shifted in the room's atmosphere again, but differently from before. Cassian was quiet for exactly as long as it took him to decide what came next. Your brother, he said. His name. This isn't about my brother anymore. I didn't ask what it was about. I asked his name. A pause. She measured him. Whatever she found in the measurement, she answered. Thomas Ashcroft. He discharged from the garrison 8 months ago. He's in Thornmere now, running the ledger work our father left. Slowly, she said the last word without sentimentality, which made it land harder. Cassian made a note in his mind that was not written anywhere. The kind of note that lived in a particular compartment he'd built over years, where certain pieces of information were kept separate from the machinery of political decision-making, in a place that was older and quieter, and that he rarely looked at directly. You present me with an interesting problem, he said. I've been told that, she said, not usually as an opening position in a conversation. Your methods were unauthorized. The evidence you gathered was obtained outside the duchy's legal framework for such matters. Any formal proceeding against Voss and the others based on your documentation would be challenged immediately and likely collapsed within a week by any competent legal defense. He watched her face. You know this. She did not flinch. Yes. Then you also know that what you've done has effectively handed 2 corrupt officials the legal high ground to argue against their own prosecution. I know, she said, and something in her voice had a different quality now. Not defeat, not quite, but the specific weight of someone carrying the knowledge that they did the right thing in the wrong way, and the wrong way has consequences. I know that I ran out of options that were clean. I kept thinking, 1 more month, 1 more document, something that couldn't be argued around. But there's always something that can be argued around if the person doing the arguing has enough money. She met his eyes. Your officials have a great deal of money. My officials, he said, and the word carried a particular edge, are not my officials any longer. That stopped her. The evidence you gathered, he continued, tone unchanged, while inadmissible in a formal proceeding, is sufficient for an internal administrative review conducted under ducal authority rather than judicial. A different standard of evidence, a different standard of outcome. He let that settle. Voss's post has been suspended since this morning. The other, Marcin, effective yesterday evening. Both will face administrative tribunal within the month. She was looking at him with an expression that was doing something complicated around the edges. Not gratitude, he noted, or not primarily that. More like recalculation, like someone who had walked into a room expecting the furniture to be arranged one way and found it different. Then why am I here? She said. Because you're not safe, he said. Voss has allies. Marcin has more. The kind of men who respond to threats against their position by creating threats against the people who made them. He held her gaze. You should have thought of this before you spent 14 months putting yourself between their ambition and their exposure. I thought of it, she said. I decided it was worth it. That was not a particularly rational decision. No, she agreed. It wasn't. Another silence. This one had different weight, not antagonistic, more like the weight of 2 people recalibrating across a distance. You'll remain in Ravencroft Castle, he said, under my direct protection, until the tribunal is concluded and the risk profile is reassessed. She stared at him, not the stare of someone who didn't understand the words, the stare of someone who understood them precisely and was searching them for the hidden cost. That's not a punishment, she said slowly. No. Then what is it? Practical, he said, and returned his attention to the dispatch he'd been reading, which was his way of ending the conversation. Aldrich will show you to your quarters. They will be appropriate to a guest, not a prisoner, though the distinction has more practical weight than symbolic. You will find that moving through certain areas of the castle requires an escort, Not because you are confined, but because the castle is large and the geography is specific, and I have no interest in losing people to staircases. He glanced up once. You'll be assigned a role if you prefer occupation to idleness, something that makes use of your particular skill set, given that you've demonstrated your skill set is considerably broader than tailoring. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then said, "You're very strange for a duke." "I've been told that," he said, in precisely the tone she had used when she told him she'd been called an interesting problem. Not usually as an opening position in a conversation. Something crossed her face that was, for just a fraction of a second, very close to unwilling amusement. She controlled it quickly, which told him it was real. Then she walked out of the study without being dismissed, which told him something else entirely. That night, in the East Wing quarters that Aldrich had prepared with the particular efficiency that characterized every task Aldrich undertook, adequate and impeccable, never comfortable enough to suggest softness, never uncomfortable enough to suggest punishment, Evelyn Ashcroft sat on the edge of a bed that was larger than her entire bedroom in Merchant's Row and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she had just agreed to. She had not agreed to anything. That was the problem, or part of it. Nothing in that conversation had involved her consent being sought. The Duke of Ravencroft had issued a determination in the same tone he presumably used to issue drainage policy, and she was now sleeping in his castle's east wing because the alternative was apparently being murdered by the allies of the men she'd exposed, and she was not quite prepared to make that particular principle stand. This was not how she had imagined this going. She had imagined, in the abstract, the barely considered way one imagines the aftermath of actions one is committed to regardless, something more straightforwardly adversarial. Being questioned, being intimidated, the full theater of noble authority performing its most ostentatious version of power to reduce her to an appropriate smallness. Instead, she'd gotten a man who read dispatches while people waited, who had noticed her looking at taxation law on a shelf, who had said the words "not a punishment" and meant them straightforwardly, without performance, as though it was simply information and she could do what she liked with it. She had expected to be afraid of him. She had sat in that room with the cold ceiling and the desk that was built for the specific purpose of communicating permanence, and she had felt many things. Sharpness, the particular kind of focus that came when she was in danger and knew it and had decided that knowing it was enough. But not fear. Not the particular flavor of it she'd expected. What she had felt instead was something harder to categorize. He had asked about Thomas. He had asked the name and then made a note of it somewhere behind his eyes, and she had watched it happen and not understood why it bothered her. It was information he could have extracted from the file. It was information she had volunteered. There was no reason for it to feel different from administrative record-keeping. It felt different from administrative record-keeping. She put that thought somewhere she was not going to examine tonight, lay down fully dressed because the situation was too new and too uncertain for vulnerability, and watched the candle on the nightstand burn down in the dark. Ravencroft Castle had a rhythm that Evelyn learned the way she learned everything. By watching it before participating in it, by understanding the mechanics before accepting the form. The eastern courtyard filled with guards at dawn. The kitchen staff moved in rotations that had the precision of military scheduling and the noise level of a controlled catastrophe. The castle's domestic hierarchy was strict and labyrinthine, built over generations into a social architecture so elaborate that navigating it incorrectly carried its own consequences. Small ones, the kind accumulated daily. She had been given, true to the Duke's word, occupation. Aldrich had appeared the second morning with the particular expression of a man who was doing something that deviated from standard procedure and was managing his professional discomfort about it with aggressive competence, and had explained that the Duke's administrative staff managed the accounts for duchy supply contracts, and that there appeared to be, he had paused here, selecting the word carefully, inconsistencies in certain record-keeping areas that would benefit from review, and that the Duke's staff had been using the same accounting methodology for 20 years and were perhaps not optimally positioned to identify problems within that methodology, and that she had demonstrated some proficiency in identifying such problems. She had looked at Aldrich for a long moment. "He's having me audit his own people," she said. "The Duke has requested assistance with supply record review," Aldrich said, in the tone of a man who was not going to confirm what she'd just said and was also not going to deny it. It was, she recognized, either a very reasonable thing to do with someone who had just proven herself capable of exactly that, or a test, or both simultaneously. She found she wasn't opposed to either interpretation. The records office they placed her in was small and real, not performative, a working room. The files in it were actual files, not curated selections designed to present a particular face. And after 2 days, she had found 4 separate anomalies in the garrison resupply and invoicing going back 11 years, 2 of which predated Voss entirely and suggested that the corruption she'd documented had roots deeper than she'd understood. She wrote up her findings in the same methodical cross-reference format her father had taught her before she was old enough to know that methodical cross-referencing was unusual. She left it on Aldrich's desk. The next day, there was a note on her work table in handwriting she did not recognize, precise and angular and without ornamentation, the handwriting of a person who writes for function, not impression. It said, "The 11th year anomaly predates my tenure. You found something I missed. Continue." No signature. She did not need one. She sat with the note for a while. The thing was, and she turned this over in the following days with the careful, slightly mistrustful attention she gave to anything that didn't fit her prior expectations. The thing was that he was not what she had built in her mind during 14 months of documenting the underside of his court's administration. The portrait she'd constructed from indirect evidence, a man whose power was total because it was ruthless, whose ruthlessness was itself a kind of satisfaction, who maintained order through the specific pleasure of punishing disorder. That portrait had not been wrong exactly, but it had been incomplete in ways she was only beginning to measure. He was in the records office one afternoon, 2 weeks into her tenure, the 3rd week of a November that had arrived in Ravencroft like a verdict, cold and absolute. When she looked up from an invoice discrepancy and found him standing at the far end of the room, looking at the wall of files she'd reorganized. He had not announced himself. He was simply there, in the manner of someone entirely accustomed to entering spaces without requiring the space to acknowledge him. "You reorganized them by quarter rather than by supplier," he said. "The supplier organization assumes the supplier is the variable," she said. "The quarter-based organization makes it easier to see where a consistent supplier started showing inconsistencies." She paused. "The discrepancies are almost never in the supplier. They're in a specific window of time." He turned and looked at her. In the thin winter light coming through the high, narrow window, he looked not less formidable, that was not the right word, more precise, like the architecture of the castle itself, which was not beautiful in any conventional sense, but was constructed with a specificity that communicated something about the mind that built it. "Why a window of time?" he said. "Because most corruption isn't ideological," she said. "People don't decide to steal in the abstract. They decide to steal when something changes, a debt, a threat, a change in their position or their sense of how much their position is worth." She looked back at the files. "Find the window and you find the pressure point. The pressure point tells you who else knows." He was quiet for a moment. "Your father," he said. She looked up. "The ledger work," he said. "He taught you." She was careful with her expression, not evasive. She had learned that evasion in front of this particular man did not function the way it was supposed to, but contained. He thought accurate records were the foundation of any fair system. He said if you couldn't see clearly what was happening, you couldn't evaluate whether it was right. A pause. He was talking about village accounting, crop yields and tax collection, small things. "No such thing as a small thing," Cassian said, "when the principle is the same." She looked at him for a moment longer than she'd intended to. Then she looked back at her files, because the alternative was continuing to look at him, and she was not entirely sure what happened in the space that was opening up in those moments of continued looking. The court noticed, of course. Courts were organs of observation. They processed everything, classified everything, stored everything in a social memory that ran beneath the formal surface of ceremony and hierarchy like groundwater beneath a field. Evelyn Ashcroft's presence in Ravencroft Castle had been a piece of information the court had absorbed within hours of her arrival, and the interpretation it had settled on, prisoner, leverage, spectacle, had already been circulated, refined, and distributed to every drawing room and corridor conversation that mattered. When the interpretation failed to conform to observable reality, the court did not discard it. It elaborated it. Lady Corvin was the first to make direct contact, which Eveline had been told by a kitchen maid named Sarah, who was 17 and possessed of the kind of perceptive intelligence that gets wasted in kitchens and occasionally redirected into extraordinary survival, was significant. Lady Corvin did not initiate contact with anyone whose social position did not warrant it. The fact that she had lowered herself to speaking with a seamstress was itself a message, though Sarah was not certain of the content. Eveline had a better guess. She met Lady Corvin in the Western Gallery, which was a long, cold walkway lined with portraits of previous Blackthorns, each of them looking as though they'd been painted in the act of judging someone. The lady was perhaps 35, with the particular elegance of a woman who had learned to make precision function as beauty, and she smiled at Eveline with the warmth of a blade that has just been oiled. "You've settled in remarkably well," Lady Corvin said, which meant, "You have lasted longer than anticipated, and this is inconvenient." "The castle is generous," Eveline said, which meant, "I know what you're doing." Lady Corvin's smile refined itself by a few degrees. "The Duke is attentive to his guests." A pause that had weight to it, pressure. "He is attentive to many things, of course, his duchy, his responsibilities, the alliances that keep this house secure." She let that land before continuing. "A man of his position carries obligations that go beyond personal inclination. I am certain you understand this." "I understand that you're telling me something," Eveline said. "I'm less certain it has anything to do with me." "Forgive me," Lady Corvin said. "I sometimes speak obliquely, a court habit." The warmth in her smile did not reach her eyes, which were doing something entirely different, measuring, calculating, the assessment of a threat. "I simply mean to say that the Duke's generosity toward you is admirable, but I would not mistake it for permanence. His family has obligations to the duchy's continuity. There are women of appropriate standing who have waited a very long time for his attention." She inclined her head. "I hope you find your stay comfortable, for however long it continues." She walked away with the particular grace of someone who has said exactly what they intended and does not require acknowledgement. Eveline stood in the gallery among the painted blackthorns and looked at them for a moment, every one of them with the same bone structure, the same jaw, the same quality of looking at the world as though they were evaluating its structural integrity. She had never given serious thought to the politics of the Duke's marital status. It had not, until this moment, been something she'd understood was relevant to her situation. She thought about it now with the focused attention she gave to accounting anomalies. She did not like what the numbers were suggesting. She found out about the letter 3 days later from Sarah, who was becoming an increasingly reliable source of castle intelligence. A formal communication from House Voreth, one of the 3 largest noble families in the kingdom, had arrived for the Duke. It contained a proposal. Their eldest daughter. A formal courtship to be completed within the season. The second letter, from House Meridane, different family, different daughter, identical purpose, arrived before the week was out. The third came 4 days after that. "This happens every year," Sarah told her, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing seasonal weather patterns. "The Duke doesn't respond. He lets them sit, sometimes for months. Then usually they disappear." She paused. "This year, they're coming faster than usual." "Why this year?" Eveline said, though she had a hypothesis. Sarah looked at her in the way that 17-year-olds who have learned to survive in a castle look at people who are pretending not to understand what they already understand. "The Duke has never kept someone from outside the nobility as a personal guest before," she said, not without it meaning something. "I work in his records office," Eveline said. "Yes," Sarah said, with the patient emphasis of someone making a point. "You do." She confronted him about it the following week. Not in the records office. There was too much pretense available in the records office. The convenient architecture of working relationship to retreat behind. She found him in the north courtyard in the early morning, the hour when the castle had not yet fully committed to being awake, cold air moving in off the cliffs, and the sea out beyond them the color of pewter. He was alone, which she suspected was rare enough to be significant. She walked out across the courtyard without asking permission, because asking permission in this castle was something she'd found she was constitutionally incapable of performing convincingly, and stopped a reasonable distance from him with the wind pulling at her hair and her hands in their pockets. "The letters from the noble houses," she said. "I know about them." He turned from whatever he had been looking at, the horizon, the sea, whatever it was that men like him looked at when they thought no one was watching. His face in the early light was its usual careful absence of expression, the default neutrality of a man who had learned a long time ago that expression was information and information was leverage. "I have correspondence," he said. "Noble families with daughters," she said, "looking for a ducal marriage, which you apparently receive every year and haven't responded to in how many years?" A pause. 7. 7 years. She let that sit. "And this year they're arriving faster, in clusters." She looked at him. "I want to know whether my presence here is the reason." He was quiet for a moment in the way that she had learned meant he was deciding something. Not hesitating. He did not hesitate, but choosing with the specific deliberateness of a man who understood that choosing was itself action. "Yes," he said. The wind moved between them. "Then you should understand something," she said. Her voice was even, not cold. She did not have his gift for using neutrality as instrument, but controlled, in the way she controlled things that mattered. "I am not a political complication to be managed. I did not come to your castle. I was brought here. I have done work in your records office that has been useful to you and will continue to be useful to you, and I intend to finish it, because the alternative is leaving an 11-year accounting fraud undocumented in your supply records, and I am not capable of doing that." She met his eyes. "But I am not a piece in whatever is happening with these letters. Whatever they're responding to, whatever they think my being here means, I need you to correct that assumption." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Just once, just briefly, something that she could not entirely name. Not quite the calculation she associated with him, not quite the neutrality. Something older than either of those, and raw, and swiftly controlled. "What if I don't want to?" he said. The words came out flat, the way his words usually came out, without inflection that would give her a foothold. But the content of them was not flat. The content of them was something else entirely. She stared at him. "What?" she said. "What if I don't want to correct it?" he said. "What if the assumption they're making is correct?" The morning air felt suddenly very specific around her. The cold of it, the sound of the sea below the cliffs, the smell of stone and salt, and the particular silence of a castle that had not yet decided it was day. "That's not—" She stopped, started again. "You don't mean that the way it sounds." "I mean it precisely the way it sounds," he said. "Which you know, because you are not a woman who mistakes words for something other than what they are." She looked at him. The Duke of Ravenscroft, the man they said had never smiled at a funeral because funerals implied surprise, the man whose ruthlessness had a clarity to it that was almost honest, and felt the ground of her understanding of this situation shift beneath her feet like something tectonic. "You barely know me," she said. "I know enough," he said. "That's—" She stopped again. There was a word she needed, and it kept not being the right one. "That's not how this works. I'm a seamstress from Merchant's Row. You're this." She gestured at the castle, the sea, the entire apparatus of power that surrounded them. "The letters exist because those families are appropriate. That's not a word I find personally important, but it matters to people like—" "If you tell me what matters to people like me," he said, with a precision in the interruption that suggested he had been waiting for that particular end of sentence, "you will be the first person in 12 years to know." The silence that followed was very long. She became aware gradually of the sound of the sea, of the fact that her hands, which she had put in her pockets as armor against the cold, had curled into fists, of the fact that he had not moved, not 1 degree, in the entirety of this conversation, anchored to this specific spot on the courtyard stones as though movement would concede something. She did not know what to say. This was unusual for her. She had spent 14 months in hostile conversations, in rooms where the stakes were her safety and the safety of the work she was doing, and she had always known what to say. She did not know what to say now. She said the only true thing available to her, "I don't know what you want from me." Something in his face, that brief, controlled thing that moved through it sometimes, that she was learning to identify without yet knowing what to call it. "I know," he said. "You will." Before she could respond, before she could locate the beginning of a response, before her mind could organize the architecture of what he'd just said into something she could argue with or against or through, the sound of boots on stone reached them both from the castle entrance. Aldrich, moving with the particular quality of urgency that on Aldrich looked like slightly faster walking. "Your Grace." He had something in his hand, a letter, sealed with wax that from across the courtyard she could already see was not the wax seal of a noble house making a marital proposal. It was heavier than that, official in a way that was different from social correspondence. From the capital, by royal courier, it arrived an hour ago. Cassian turned, took the letter, broke the seal. The change in him was not large. It would not have been visible to anyone who had not spent 6 weeks in the same castle, learning the grammar of his silences and the specific weight of his stillness. But she was watching, and she saw it. Something happened in his face. Not fear, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has just read words that reconfigure the landscape of everything around him. "What is it?" she said, because she could not help it, because whatever was in that letter had just reached across the courtyard and changed the temperature of everything. He folded it, put it away, looked at her. His face was completely controlled again, the neutrality absolute. But his hands, which she had never once seen betray anything, the hands of a man who had been the Duke of Ravencroft since he was 19 years old and had learned before that what it cost to let hands speak, were very slightly, very briefly, not still. "There's going to be a Grand Sovereign's Assembly," he said, "convened by royal decree, all major houses." A pause. "Required attendance." She waited. "In Ravencroft," he said. "Here." Here. He looked at the castle, Motz, his castle, the thing carved from cliff and blood and 300 years of blackthorn survival. And the look on his face was one she had not seen before on him, on anyone she knew. The look of a man who has just understood that the ground he stands on is not as solid as he believed. "All of them," she said. "In this castle, the families whose letters are sitting on your desk." "Yes." "And me," she said, not a question. His eyes came back to her face. "Yes," he said. "And you." And somewhere below them, beyond the cliff face, the sea made the sound that seas make before a storm. Not the wave itself, not the wind, but the low, vast, pre-articulate sound of pressure building in deep water, in the dark, before anything yet broke the surface. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are products of the imagination. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental. The royal decree was 12 lines long. Cassian had read it 4 times before he folded it, and each reading had produced the same result. Not new information, but a deeper understanding of the shape of what was coming. 12 lines from the king's chancellery, signed and sealed, requiring the attendance of all major noble houses at Ravencroft Castle within 3 weeks for a Grand Sovereign's Assembly. The stated purpose was alliance consolidation and review of kingdom-wide administrative policy. The unstated purpose was visible to anyone who had spent 36 years learning how power communicated when it wanted to avoid saying something directly. They were coming to look at him, to assess whether the Duke of Ravencroft was still a reliable instrument, or whether the rumors, the seamstress, the protection order, the refusal of 7 years' worth of marital proposals, accelerating now into something that the capital could not afford to ignore, indicated instability at a strategic border position. He He stood at the window of his private study for a while after Aldrich left, and let himself think about the problem the way he thought about flood systems and supply routes, structurally. The assembly would bring every house that had sent him a letter in the past month. It would bring their daughters, probably, as living arguments. It would bring allies of Voss and Marson, who were not yet broken and would not arrive broken, and would use the social architecture of a sovereign's assembly. The formal gatherings, the private conversations, the precise hierarchy of seating at dinner, to reconstruct whatever credibility they could. And it would bring all of that into his castle, which was simultaneously his strongest position and his most exposed one, because Ravenscroft was his, and they knew it was his, and they would act accordingly. He thought about Eveline in the courtyard, the wind in her hair and the specific quality of her stillness when he said what he'd said. Not the stillness of shock, not quite, but the stillness of a very precise mind processing something it had not anticipated and refusing to react before processing was complete. He had not planned to say it. That was the part that sat with him now, uncomfortable in the way that anything unplanned was uncomfortable, not wrong, but requiring examination. He did not say things he hadn't considered. He had built his entire adult life on the architecture of considered speech, on the principle that words deployed without intention were weapons pointed in the wrong direction. He had said it anyway. He went back to his desk and began writing the response letters to the noble houses that the assembly now made necessary. Gio. The castle changed in the 2 weeks that followed. Not dramatically. Ravenscroft did not do dramatic. It did incremental and then sudden, the way pressure systems built before weather. But Eveline felt it. The staff expanded, the kitchen operating on a different scale, supply deliveries arriving daily, and being cataloged with the kind of systematic attention that suggested whoever managed Ravenscroft's hospitality had done this before and understood the specific performance requirements of hosting men who were coming to judge the host. She kept working. This was her answer to the situation, which she recognized was not an answer so much as an extension of the only thing she trusted herself to do: find the anomaly, document the truth, produce the work. The 11-year accounting discrepancy had branched into 3 separate threads, each requiring its own mapping, and the mapping was the kind of thing that required sustained attention and did not care what political storm was building outside the records office window. She was there on the 14th day when Lady Corvin came back. This time she brought 2 women with her. One was perhaps Eveline's age, perhaps a year younger, dark-haired and constructed with the particular deliberate beauty of a woman who had been trained to be beautiful the way soldiers were trained to fight, systematically, from childhood, with specific strategic purpose. She was introduced as Lady Maren Voreth, the House Voreth daughter. Eveline recognized the name from the letters Sarah had described. The other woman was older, 50 or more, with the face of someone who had decided long ago that expressions were a resource and should be conserved. She was not introduced at all, which was its own kind of introduction. "We were touring the East Wing," Lady Corvin said pleasantly, which meant they had walked deliberately to the records office, and the tour was a fiction for social lubrication. "I didn't realize you worked in here." "Every day," Eveline said. She did not stand. Standing was concession to a social hierarchy she had not agreed to participate in, and she was not going to participate in it now with 3 women who had come here to look at her. Lady Maren Voreth looked at the files on Eveline's desk with an expression that was not contempt exactly, too careful for contempt, too controlled, but had contempt skeleton underneath it. "Supply records," she said. "Accounting," Eveline said. "The distinction matters." Lady Maren met her eyes. Something happened there. Assessment, the kind conducted by someone who had been taught that assessment was always a competition, and winning it required showing nothing while taking everything. "Of course," she said. Her voice was excellent. Trained, probably, like the rest of her. "The Duke values precision," Lady Corvin said with the specific emphasis of someone embedding a message in pleasant language. "In all things." She let that float. "We were saying at dinner last evening it was a small dinner, just the first arrivals, that Ravenscroft's reputation for precision is one of its most admirable qualities. A house that knows what it is." "And what it needs," the older woman said, the first word she'd spoken. She had a voice like weight. Evelyn looked at her. Houses like Ravencroft, the older woman continued, holding Evelyn's gaze with the absolute comfort of someone who had never once in her life been uncertain of her right to hold a gaze, have survived as long as they have because they understand the difference between what is wanted and what is required. A pause. Personal inclination is a luxury of lesser men. And lesser women, Evelyn said. The older woman's expression did not change, but she looked at Evelyn for 1 second longer than the previous look, and in that second something shifted. Not softening, not the opposite of softening, but a recalibration, like a weapon adjusting its range. "Enjoy your records," Lady Corvin said, and moved them all out with the ease of someone who had said what they came to say and did not require a receipted response. Evelyn sat in the empty office for a moment. Then she went back to her accounting. The assembly began arriving on a Wednesday. By Thursday morning, there were 43 guests in Ravencroft Castle. By Friday evening, there were 61. The great hall that Evelyn had never seen used. She had been avoiding the main castle the way one avoids a room where a large argument is in progress, was apparently transformed nightly into the specific theater of aristocratic dinner that required 3 hours and 17 separate pieces of silverware. She ate in the records office. Sarah brought food. It was an arrangement that suited everyone. Cassian found her there on Friday night. He came without Aldrich, which she had learned to recognize as its own kind of signal. Aldrich was armor, functional and precise, and appearing without him meant something about the nature of the conversation to follow. He sat down in the chair across from her desk without asking, which she found she had stopped noticing as unusual. "You've been avoiding the hall," he said. "I've been working." "You've been avoiding the hall," he said again, the same tone, the first statement not a question, and the second statement not an escalation, but a clarification. The distinction mattered in his speech. "Lady Voreth asked about you at dinner." She looked up. "Which one?" "Both." Something moved in his face. Not quite amusement, the structural precursor to it. "The daughter asked where you were. The mother asked what you were." "Efficient family," she said. "House Voreth usually is." He looked at the files on her desk, the branching threads of the 11-year fraud mapped now across 3 separate ledgers she'd built from scratch. "What did you find?" "The third thread connects to the southern supply route, not the northern one," she said. "Which means whoever initiated this had access to both route auditors, not just one. That's a different level of access than a mid-tier court official. Voss was executing something, not designing it." Cassian was still. The particular stillness that meant he was thinking, not waiting. "Who?" he said. "I don't know yet." She paused. "But the methodology is consistent across 11 years. Same structure, same concealment approach, same window every quarter where the numbers get adjusted. Whoever taught Voss this taught someone before Voss." She met his eyes. "This goes back further than your tenure." Something in his face, a tightening, small and controlled. The expression of a man who has just confirmed a thing he'd suspected and does not like the confirmation. "Show me," he said. So she showed him. Spread the ledgers out between them on the desk, traced the threads with her finger, explained the logic in the flat, practical language she used for things that mattered. No ornamentation. He followed without interruption, which was the best quality in a person receiving information. The ability to receive it cleanly, without the static of their own prior assumptions interfering. At the end, he sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You know what this means," he said. "It means someone in this castle, or closely connected to it, has been benefiting from this for over a decade," she said, "and is probably currently attending your assembly." The word you landed between them with a specific weight. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. The candle on the desk threw light sideways across his face, the jaw, the line of it, the architecture that appeared in the portraits upstairs distilled into something more current and less monumental. He looked tired, she realized. Not weak tired. Tired the way structural materials get tired. The same, fully functional, but with more history in them than they were originally built for. "You should be at the dinner," she said. "I was at the dinner," he said, for 2 hours. "That's sufficient. For the diplomacy requirements. For my tolerance of Lord Meridane's opinions on northern border taxation." He looked at her. "He's wrong. About nearly everything. But he has 11,000 in military levy, and his daughter plays the harpsichord exceptionally well, and that's apparently considered relevant. She looked at him for a moment. Do you want her to be relevant? It was a more direct question than she'd intended. She watched it land. No, he said, without pause. Without the consideration he applied to most things, which was itself information about how long he'd already considered it. The silence in the office had a specific quality, not comfortable, not uncomfortable, but charged in a way she'd stopped being able to pretend was professional. Cassian, she said, and heard herself use the name without the title for the first time, which happened before she decided it was happening, a thing her mouth did in advance of her mind's permission. He went very still. Not the thinking stillness, a different one. You cannot want this, she said. The words came out with more force than she'd aimed for, pressing against something. Not actually. I understand that I'm different from the women in that hall. I understand that difference is interesting, but interesting isn't the same as… She stopped, started again. There are 60 people in your castle right now who came here specifically because of what your choice means for the kingdom's northern border and your house's political future. Every decision you make this week gets read. Every conversation you have gets interpreted. And if you… She stopped again. I'm not equipped for this. This world, these people, and what they need from you, and what they'll do to anyone standing between them and what they need. He was looking at her through all of this with the expression he used when he was letting someone finish a thing he already had an answer to. Are you afraid? He said. I'm practical, she said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. No, she said. They're not. She held his gaze. Yes, I'm afraid. Of what this is. Of what it would cost. Of being in that hall tomorrow and knowing what every person in it is actually thinking when they look at me. She said it plainly because plainness was the only language she trusted herself not to ruin. I don't know how to be what you'd need me to be in there. He leaned forward, both elbows on the desk, closing some of the distance across it, and looked at her with the directness that she'd come to understand was the most honest version of him. The one that existed when he stopped managing the performance of authority and just looked at something because it was what he was looking at. I'm not asking you to be anything, he said. I'm asking you to stay. The words hit somewhere that wasn't in her chest exactly, but was adjacent to it. That's not a small ask, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked at him. Duke of Ravencroft, 36 years old and built like his castle, from the inside out, stone over stone, each layer load-bearing. A man who had told her he didn't want to correct the assumption and meant it with the specific weight of a person who does not say things they don't mean, and who had come to her records office on a Friday night instead of sitting in the Great Hall managing 60 political relationships because apparently this was where he wanted to be. She said nothing for a while. Then she said, I'll come to the dinner tomorrow. Something in his face, that thing, the brief unguarded one. Good, he said. He left without ceremony, which was how he did everything, and she sat in the office alone with the candle burning lower and the ledger spread out between her and where he'd been sitting, and the specific knowledge that tomorrow she was going to walk into that hall and every person in it was going to look at her and know what their looking meant. She was afraid of it. She went anyway. The Saturday dinner was a different animal from whatever Friday had been. More people. More silverware, apparently. More of the particular charged atmosphere of 60 powerful people in one room, all performing pleasantness while their actual attention moved like current beneath the surface, assessing, calculating, measuring the distances between pieces on a board that only some of them could fully see. Evelyn wore the best dress she had, which was not good enough for this room, and she knew it, and had decided that knowing it was enough, that dressing to compensate would be its own kind of performance. And performance in front of people who had spent their lives studying performance was the surest path to losing. She was seated. She understood, from the precision of the placement, that seating at a dinner like this was not administrative, it was argument. 3 seats from Cassian's right. Not beside him. Not across from him. 3 seats, which was close enough to be visible and far enough to be deniable, and she understood this was his version of careful, his acknowledgement that there was a game in this room, and he was not going to sacrifice position by being too obvious too early. She could work with that. Lord Meridane was to her left. 60, broad, with the face of a man who had been told his opinions were important since birth and had organized his entire personality around this information. He looked at her once when she sat down with an expression that lasted exactly long enough to communicate that he had assessed her and filed her under irrelevant, and then he turned to the man on his other side and began a conversation about grain tariffs. Lady Marin Voreth was 4 seats to Cassian's left, which put her in Evelyn's sightline and vice versa. She was dressed with the specific intentionality of a woman deploying beauty as instrument. She laughed at something the man beside her said, and her laugh was excellent, warm and precisely calibrated, landing in the room like a well-thrown thing. She caught Evelyn looking and did not look away. Evelyn did not look away either. They held this for 3 seconds across the candlelit length of the table, 2 women who understood each other's position with perfect clarity and no particular hostility, because hostility was personal, and this was not personal. This was structural. 2 vectors aimed at the same point, and the point was sitting 3 seats to Evelyn's left, presiding over 61 people with the expression of a man who had organized this room the way he organized everything, completely, in advance, with every contingency mapped. He had not looked at her since she sat down. This, she realized after 15 minutes, was also deliberate. He was looking at everyone else, rotating his attention through the room with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that where a duke's eyes went was information, and he was distributing that information evenly, deliberately, giving no one the confirmation they were looking for. He looked at her on the 45th minute. Just once, just briefly, the duration of a single breath, and then away, back to Lord Meridane's nearest equivalent, seamlessly, as though the look had not happened. But she had seen what was in it. Not the neutrality, not the careful absence of expression that governed his face and company. Something underneath that. The look of a man checking on something that matters to him. The specific involuntary quality of attention that happens when someone is trying not to look at something and fails. She felt it in her sternum. Lord Meridane turned to her somewhere in the second hour, with the manner of a man who has run out of opinions to distribute in his preferred direction and has decided to expand his audience. "You're the Duke's record keeper," he said. Not a question, a classification. "Accounting consultant," she said. He processed this in the way that large men process information they have decided is unimportant. Unusual arrangement. "The duchy's supply records had irregularities going back 11 years, she said pleasantly. "Unusual problems benefit from unusual arrangements." Something sharpened in his eyes. Just briefly. Lord Meridane, she noted, was not as uncomplicated as his surface presentation. 11 years, he said. "Give or take." "And you identified this?" "The Duke identified that identification was needed," she said. "I did the identifying." A pause. He looked at her with the recalibrated attention of a man reassessing a field he thought he'd already surveyed. Then he said, "Your father was a ledger keeper, Thornmere District." She kept her face still. "Yes." "I knew him," Meridane said, "slightly. 30 years ago when my family had holdings in the South. Honorable man." He said honorable the way people said it when they meant it rather than when they meant it as a social lubricant. "He kept good records." "He did," she said. Meridane looked at her for another moment in which she had the specific sensation of being reprocessed. Then he turned back to his plate without further comment, and she thought, that was not nothing. Whatever that was, it was not nothing. The conversation that ended the evening happened in the corridor outside the hall. She was leaving, early enough that it was a choice, late enough that it was not a flight, when Lady Voreth's mother appeared from a side passage with the timing of someone who had been waiting. The older woman, still unnamed in the mode she seemed to prefer, the armor of anonymity. "You handled yourself well in there," she said. Evelyn stopped. "Thank you." It wasn't a compliment, it was an observation. She looked at Evelyn with the gray eyes that Lady Marin had inherited, same shade, different temperature. "You understand what tonight was." "An assessment," Evelyn said. "A warning," the older woman said, "from everyone in that room, The Duke's indulgences have been overlooked before because they were contained, private. This is no longer contained. She paused. There are families in that hall who have invested years in the expectation of a particular outcome. They will not redirect that investment without cost. She said this without heat. It was information, not threat. Or it was both, the way all information in this castle was both. Whatever you think you have here, it is built on ground that 60 people are currently deciding whether to remove. I know that, Evelyn said. Then you know that the Duke's declaration of protection, personal protection, public protection, the kind he made when he had you placed in his castle, was not a small thing. It was a statement. The older woman's eyes on her were steady. He has made statements before that he eventually walked back, quietly, without ceremony. It was the coldest thing anyone had said to her since she arrived. She stood with it. I appreciate your candor, she said, and meant it. The older woman looked at her for one more moment. That recalibrating look again, the weapon-adjusting range, and then walked away without further ceremony. Eveline stood in the corridor alone and felt the ground of the situation beneath her with the careful attention of a person who has learned that the ground deserves attention. She was still standing there when Aldrich appeared, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man who had spent 17 years being exactly where he needed to be, exactly when he needed to be there. Your Grace requests your presence, he said. The private study. She followed him without asking why, because the why was apparent. The dinner was over, the performance was done, and whatever the Duke of Ravenscroft actually needed to say required a room without 60 witnesses. The study was cold. The fire had not been lit. Cassian was standing at the window that looked north, toward the cliffs and the sea, with a document in his hand that she recognized from across the room, the shape of it, the official weight of court paper. He turned when she came in. Close the door, he said. She closed it. He crossed the room and put the document on the desk between them, and she looked at it and understood within the first 3 lines what she was reading. It was a formal petition, filed collectively, signed by 14 noble houses, including Voreth and Meridane, requiring the Duke of Ravenscroft to formalize his marital intentions within 30 days in the interest of Northern Duchy political stability, or submit to a kingdom review of his fitness to hold the position independently. She read it twice. Then she set it down. 30 days, she said. Yes, and the review means the King's Council assesses whether Ravenscroft should remain under sole Blackthorn authority or be placed under joint noble oversight pending resolution. He said it flatly. It has never been invoked for a reigning duke. It has been invoked for 2 counts. Neither survived it, with their position intact. She looked at him. Then you respond to the petition. Yes. Within 30 days. Yes. She understood the shape of what he was not saying. The petition was designed to give him 2 paths. Marry one of the daughters currently sleeping in his guest rooms, or lose everything his family had spent 300 years building. It was elegant in the way that traps are elegant, the mechanism clean, the exit invisible. She also understood that he had called her into this room. He had read this document, which changed the landscape of everything, which drew a line and said, you have 30 days to decide what you are. And he had asked for her. What do you need from me, she said, and her voice was steadier than she'd expected it to be. He looked at her across the desk, across the document, across the space between them that had been accumulating weight for 6 weeks. I need you to understand something, he said, before the 30 days start, before anything else. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before, stripped of the management, the careful neutrality, something underneath that was raw and less constructed. I didn't choose this position. I inherited it. Everything I've done since I was 19 years old has been in service of keeping it intact. Every alliance I didn't make, every marriage I didn't enter. He paused. Every person I kept at a distance because distance was simpler than the alternative. She waited. I'm not interested in simple anymore, he said. The room was very quiet. Outside, distant, the sound of the sea. Cassian, I'm going to respond to the petition, he said. Tomorrow morning, formally, on the record. He held her gaze. I'm going to tell them that the Duke of Ravenscroft has already determined his intentions and does not require their 30-day deadline to clarify them. She understood, in the space between one breath and the next, what he was about to say. "Don't," she said. "Not without—" "Your name," he said, "is going in that response." The world rearranged itself around those 6 words. Not loudly, not with the drama that the moment seemed to require, just the quiet tectonic shift of a thing that cannot be walked back once it is done. A document signed, a name written, a declaration made to 14 noble houses and the king's council and the entire architecture of a kingdom that had been waiting 30 days for an answer and was about to get one that nobody in that dining hall had anticipated. She stood in the cold study with the fire unlit and 60 enemies sleeping in the rooms above her and looked at the Duke of Ravenscroft, who was looking back at her with the specific expression of a man who has made a decision and is not asking permission. "They'll come after me," she said. "Yes," he said, "which is why I need to know right now." And the rawness in his voice again, the thing underneath the architecture. "Whether you're going to run." She looked at him for a long time. The sea was audible through the stone walls. Somewhere above them, 60 people were sleeping in the certainty that tomorrow's answer was already written. It was, just not the way they'd expected. "I'm not running," she said. He exhaled once, a single breath, controlled immediately, but she saw it. "Then tomorrow," he said, "changes everything." This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are products of the imagination. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental. The response went out at dawn. Cassian signed it himself, which was not how formal responses to noble petitions were typically handled. Typically, there was a secretary, a clerk, the layered insulation of administrative procedure between a duke's hand and anything that could be used against him. He signed it himself because he wanted no ambiguity about authorship, no room for anyone to argue that a subordinate had misinterpreted the duke's intentions or overstepped in the drafting. The language was precise. The Duke of Ravenscroft, having reviewed the petition submitted by the assembled houses, found its premises flawed and its deadline irrelevant. The Duke's intentions regarding the duchy's future were not subject to external timeline requirements. The duchy's political stability was not contingent on the marital preferences of visiting nobles, and the individual currently residing at Ravenscroft Castle under ducal protection, Evelyn Ashcroft, by name spelled correctly, no title attached because she did not yet have one, and he was not going to give her a fictional one in a formal document, was not a matter open to assembly review. 14 copies. One for each signatory house, delivered by castle staff before the breakfast hour, so that every lord and lady in Ravenscroft woke to the answer already in their hands. Cassian was in the north courtyard when the first reaction reached him. Not a person, a sound, the specific quality of a large house going from silence to motion all at once, the way a disturbed body of water moved outward from a single point in every direction simultaneously. He stood in the cold morning air and listened to it and felt underneath the controlled surface of everything he was the specific sensation of a man who has just committed to a direction and cannot see the far end of it. Not fear. Something that lived in the same neighborhood. The knowledge that the ground ahead was uncharted and that uncharted ground was the only kind that mattered. He went inside to begin the day. The first formal objection came from Lord Meridane, which surprised Cassian slightly because Meridane had seemed, at dinner, like a man performing outrage rather than feeling it. The objection arrived in his study before the breakfast dishes were cleared, and it was long. Meridane, whatever else he was, could write. The argument was structurally sound. The petition had legal standing under kingdom-wide administrative precedent. The Duke's response did not engage with that standing. A non-engagement was not the same as a refusal, and therefore the petition remained active, and the 30-day period had begun regardless of Cassian's stated position. It was, Cassian recognized, correct. He read it twice and set it down and looked at the wall for a moment and thought about what his father would have done with a problem this shape. His father had been a man who solved problems by compressing them, taking anything complicated and squeezing it until the complexity was gone and only the load-bearing structure remained. He had been ruthless in the clinical sense, the way scalpels are ruthless, precise removal of what did not serve the primary function. Cassian had inherited this, but had spent 17 years refining it into something that operated more slowly and, he had believed, more surely. Building rather than compressing. Architecture over demolition. The petition was a test of which one he actually was. He wrote back to Meridain in 4 lines and said, "Then the 30 days begin. The Duke of Ravencroft will use them as he sees fit." Eveline heard about the response from Sarah, who had heard about it from the kitchen staff, who had heard the specific kind of noise that travels through castle walls when 60 people are having simultaneous private conversations about the same thing. She sat with it for an hour. Then she went to find Aldrich. She found him in the administrative corridor outside the records office, moving with his characteristic efficiency between 2 tasks that she had never quite identified individually because they always seemed to be part of a continuous single task that had been running for 17 years. "The response named me," she said. "Yes," he said. He did not stop moving, but he slowed, which for Aldrich was the equivalent of stopping. "By name, in a formal document, to 14 noble houses." "Yes." She looked at him. "He should have told me before he sent it." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who didn't have an answer. "The Duke makes decisions about Ravencroft's formal positions without consulting the parties named in them," he said carefully. "This is standard. The response is a ducal document, not a joint declaration." "I know what it is," she said. "I'm telling you it should have been different." Aldrich looked at her for a moment, the look of a man who was doing something he did not often do, which was assessing a situation from a position other than pure function. "I will convey that to the Duke," he said. "Don't," she said. "I'll tell him myself." She turned to go back to the records office and stopped. The corridor had 2 entrances. The far one, 20 feet away, currently had a person in it who had not been there 10 seconds ago. Lord Voreth, the patriarch of House Voreth, a man she had not previously met because he had not been at the dinner, had apparently arrived late in the assembly and was not someone she had a physical reference for. He was perhaps 55, tall, the kind of face that had been handsome 20 years ago and had cured into something denser and more permanent. He was looking at her with an expression that she identified, in the half-second before she had time to prepare for it, as something she had not seen directed at her before in this castle. Not assessment, not the social calculation of the other nobles, the measuring of her threat level or her utility. Recognition, as though he knew her in a way that preceded this moment. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. The use of her name, not her title, because she had none, but her name, precisely, in the corridor outside the records office, was information. He had known where to find her. He had known what she looked like. "Lord Voreth," she said. "I hoped we might speak," he said. His voice was measured in a different way from Cassian's. Cassian's control was internal, structural, built from the inside. Voreth's was practiced. The control of a man who had learned to manage his voice the way politicians managed public statements. "About the response," she said. "About a number of things." He glanced at Aldrich. The glance communicated, with aristocratic efficiency, that the conversation was not for additional ears. Aldrich looked at her. She said, "It's fine." It was not fine, but she wanted to know what he was going to say. Voreth spoke for 12 minutes, and she listened to all of it, and at the end of it she stood in the corridor with the specific sensation of the floor being structurally different from what she'd understood it to be. He did not threaten her. This was the part that she kept returning to afterward. The absence of threat. The way the conversation had been constructed entirely out of information, delivered in the measured tone of someone who wanted her to understand something rather than to fear something. He told her about the 11-year fraud she'd been documenting. He told her the name at the origin of it. The person who had built the methodology, recruited Voss, established the structure that had been running quietly through Ravencroft's supply accounts for over a decade. He told her this name, and she stood very still while the name arranged itself in her understanding and changed the shape of everything around it. Then he said, "I'm telling you this because the Duke trusts this person, has trusted them since before he inherited the duchy. And because I believe you are the only person currently in this castle who might be able to make him understand what I've just told you before tomorrow's formal assembly session." He paused. "After tomorrow, the information becomes a weapon in a much larger war. Before tomorrow, it is still just the truth." She said, "Why do you care whether he knows before or after?" He looked at her. Something in his face that she would not have expected there. Something that was not entirely political. "I have been attempting to negotiate a marital alliance with House Blackthorn for 6 years," he said. "I know this man better than most people in that hall. He deserves to know who built the cage around him before the cage is used publicly against him." A pause. "Whatever else is happening here, whatever I think about his response this morning, whatever my house needs from this assembly, I owe him that." She looked at Lord Voreth for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," she said. "Most people aren't," he said, and walked away down the corridor. She went to find Cassian immediately, which meant navigating the castle's main floor during the mid-morning hour when the assembly was active and every corridor had people in it, and she moved through them with the focused efficiency of someone who did not have time for the social mechanics of a gathering she hadn't asked to be part of. She found him in the East Gallery, in conversation with 2 men she didn't recognize, and waited at the entrance with the patience she used for things that required patience and the contained urgency of someone carrying information that was actively burning. He saw her after 30 seconds. Finished the sentence he was in the middle of. Made the kind of excuse that high-ranking people make when they need to leave a conversation without explaining why. Came to her. "Voreth spoke to you," he said. Not a question. "How did you—" "Aldrich," he said simply. She looked at him. "He told me something about the accounting fraud, about who built it." She paused. "I need to tell you in private." His face did not change, but something behind it, a shift, very small, the internal rearrangement of a man who already half knew what was coming and had been waiting for the shape of it to clarify. "Study," he said. She told him in the study, with the fire lit this time, and watched his face while she said the name. Aldrich. 17 years. The man who had survived every storm this duchy had produced, who had been in this position since before Cassian inherited it, who had built himself into the architecture of Ravencroft so completely that removing him would require structural surgery. The man who had told her about the Duke's habits and the castle's geography on her first day, who had shown her to the records office, who had been present in every significant conversation she'd had in this castle, who had been in the corridor when Voreth arrived. Cassian stood at the window, and she watched him take the information and hold it with the stillness of a man lifting something much heavier than he'd prepared for. "Voreth has documentation," she said. "He says he'll present it at tomorrow's session if the Duke doesn't act first." The silence lasted a while. 17 years, Cassian said. Not to her, to himself, or to the window, or to the specific geometry of a betrayal that had been running so close to him for so long that it had become part of the background, part of the texture of daily operation. She said nothing. Some information needed room. "He was my father's man first," Cassian said. "He came with the position. When my father died and I was 19 and the duchy was—" He stopped. "Aldrich was the one who stayed. Everyone else was measuring what they could take while I was still learning what I'd inherited. Aldrich stayed." She understood in this moment the specific weight of what betrayal cost when it came from that direction. Not the political damage, not the legal exposure, the older thing underneath it. The particular wound of being used by someone you trusted specifically because they were there when everything was falling. "He may have been turned," she said carefully. "Someone may have—" "No." The word was quiet and absolute. "I know what compelled looks like. I know what coerced looks like. I've had 30 years of watching both." He turned from the window. His face was the controlled version, the neutrality, but it was doing it at a cost that was visible in the line of his jaw. "He built it himself. That's what you found. Same methodology for 11 years, same structure. That's not someone who was recruited into someone else's plan. That's someone who had a plan." She held his gaze. "What do you want to do?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man running calculations at a speed that his face was not quite containing. "I want to burn it down," he said. "All of it. Every relationship in this castle, every alliance in that hall. I want to—" He stopped. Something moved through his face, sharp and dark and quickly controlled. "That's what he would want me to do. Voreth and the petition and the assembly session tomorrow. They're waiting for me to do exactly that. Destroy everything in reaction. Give them the Duke who rules by demolition instead of architecture." He sat down at the desk. Not with the deliberate authority of a man taking his position. With the specific weight of someone who has been standing very straight for a very long time and has just allowed his spine to be human for a moment. "I built 17 years of this duchy's stability on a foundation that was being hollowed out from underneath," he said. "Every supply decision I made, every garrison posting, every administrative reform." He looked at the desk, not at her. "Based on records that someone was managing to keep me looking in the wrong direction." She crossed the room and sat down across from him, not in the lower chair. She pulled it level, adjusted it, and sat at the same height, which was a thing she'd never done before in this room and which he noticed and did not comment on. "The 11-year fraud is documented," she said, "not by Voreth's material, by my work, my ledgers, cross-referenced 3 separate threads that converge on a methodology and a source." She held his eyes. "That documentation exists independent of anything Voreth presents tomorrow. Whatever he does with it publicly, you have the primary record. Your record, built on your authority, in your records office." He looked at her. "You built the cage evidence," she said. "Not him, before Voreth, before the assembly, before any of it became political. You tasked me with finding inconsistencies, and I found them, and they're documented in your duchy's own administrative record." She let that settle. "That changes the shape of what tomorrow looks like." The study was very quiet. Then he said, "He'll know we have it. The moment I move on him, he'll know we had it before Voreth." "Yes," she said, "he has 17 years of access to this castle, its records, its passages." He said this with the flatness of a man stating a danger that is not hypothetical. "He knows where everything is, who reports to whom, every loyalty I've built, and how it was built." "I know," she said. "That means tonight is the most dangerous night Ravencroft has had in a long time," he said. "Before I can act, before I can move any piece, while he still has full access and no reason to think I know." She looked at him across the desk in the firelit study and felt the specific weight of that. The castle rearranged in her mind, the geography of it suddenly textured differently, every corridor and passage and relationship in it carrying the new information that the man who had operated it for 17 years had been operating something else underneath it. "So we move tonight," she said. "No," he said. "I move tonight. If you tell me to go to my room," she said, "I will argue with you until morning and we will have wasted the night." He looked at her. "I found the ledgers," she said. "I know the structure of what he built. If there's documentation in this castle that he kept separate from the official records, and there will be, because anyone running something this long keeps their own version, I know what it looks like, what to find." She held his gaze. "You need me for this." The silence lasted long enough to mean he knew she was right. "There is a passage," he said finally, "that connects the administrative wing to the lower records archive. Aldrich knows it. I have never had reason to wonder why he knew it." "Where does it come out?" she said. He told her. Then he stood up and went to the fireplace and took from the mantelpiece a key she had not noticed before. Old iron, heavy, the kind of key that was not decorative, and held it for a moment. "My father gave me this," he said. "The master key for the lower archive. He gave it to me on the day I inherited the duchy and told me it was the only one." He set it on the desk between them. Either he lied, or Aldrich found another way in. She looked at the key, then she picked it up. Bochang. The castle at midnight was a different building. Not in structure, not in the permanence of its stone. Ravencroft was the same in the dark as in the daylight, built too solidly for atmosphere to change its geometry. But the people in it were differently distributed, differently configured, and the absence of daylight's social performance stripped everything down to function. She She moved through the passage he'd described, narrow, cold, the smell of old stone and something older than old stone. The key was in her pocket. The candle she carried threw shadows that moved ahead of her like they were in a hurry. The lower archive was exactly where he'd said it would be, reached through a door at the passage's end that responded to the key with the heavy reluctance of a mechanism not recently used. She stepped inside. 20 minutes. She found it in 12. Not because she was lucky, because she understood the methodology now, had spent weeks inside the logic of how this particular mind organized concealed information. And when she applied that logic to the physical space of the archive, she knew within 6 feet of shelf where the secondary record would be. Different paper, different binding, same hand in the entries, but she knew the handwriting from the quarterly adjustment windows she'd documented. A ledger, running parallel to the official record, tracking not what the official record said, but what the official record was designed to conceal. Names, amounts, dates, recipients. She stood in the cold archive with the candle throwing orange light across the pages and read, and what she read was the answer to questions she hadn't known to ask. The fraud was not primarily financial. The money was secondary. The primary function of the 11-year methodology was information, routing false supply data in ways that created specific vulnerabilities in garrison coverage, specific gaps, specific windows where the northern border of Ravencroft Duchy had less military capacity than the official record showed. Those windows aligned with dates. She recognized 3 of the dates. Political events. Kingdom-level negotiations where Ravencroft's defensive strength had been a factor in the calculus. Someone had been using Aldrich's framework to make Ravencroft look stronger on paper and weaker on the ground, repeatedly, at precise moments when that information would matter to the right people. This was not embezzlement. This was intelligence work. She closed the ledger and stood with it in her hands and felt the specific coldness of understanding something that was considerably larger and more dangerous than the thing she'd thought she was looking at. She turned to go. Aldrich was standing in the doorway. He had a candle, too. He had probably had it for some time. He was looking at her with the expression she now recognized as his actual face. Not the competent neutrality she'd been reading as professional character for 6 weeks, but something older and more deliberate. The face of a man who had been watching her find this room in his mind for weeks, calculating when it would happen, deciding what to do when it did. "You're faster than I estimated," he said. Not accusation. Assessment. She held the ledger. She did not step back. There was wall directly behind her, and stepping back would have communicated something she was not willing to communicate. "The garrison coverage gaps," she said. Her voice was even. "Who were you reporting to?" He looked at her for a moment. "Set the ledger down." "No," she said. The word sat between them in the archive like a stone dropped in water. Something shifted in Aldrich's expression. Not anger. Something more exhausted than anger. The look of a man who has been maintaining a complicated structure for 17 years and has just watched a portion of it identify itself. "The Duke trusts you," he said. "That's the part I didn't account for, not the trust. I understood the trust was developing. I didn't account for how quickly." He paused. "He doesn't trust people quickly. He hasn't in years." "Because someone made sure he had reason not to," she said. "Made sure every relationship in this castle ran through you first." Aldrich said nothing. "How many of them are yours?" she said. "The staff, the guards." "Enough," he said. The candlelight between them was the only warm thing in the room. "Call for him," Aldrich said. Not threatening, instructing, in the same tone she'd heard him use for 17 years of castle operations. "Call for the Duke. Bring him here. Show him the ledger. He'll react the way he always reacts to threats, immediately and completely. He'll move to contain it. And in the time it takes him to do that, the people I need to speak to will have what they need from this assembly, and I will be gone, and this will be, He paused. "Finished." She stared at him. "You're telling me your exit plan," she said. "I'm telling you the version where nobody gets hurt," he said. "There's another version. I'd prefer not to use it." She looked at Aldrich. 17-year Aldrich, the man who had shown her to her room on the first day, who had brought her work to the records office, who had been in every corridor at every significant moment. and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has just seen the whole structure at once, that the threat was real, that the people he'd referenced were real, and that Cassian was somewhere in this castle right now moving on a problem without knowing that the problem had already moved first. She opened her mouth, not to call for Cassian, to say, "You should have picked a faster exit," because she had been in this archive for 12 minutes before Aldrich arrived, and she had not come here alone. The door at the far end of the archive, the second door, the one she'd noted on entry and said nothing about, opened, and Cassian Blackthorne walked through it. He looked at Aldrich across the length of the room with the expression that had no name she'd ever found for it, the one that appeared when he had already understood something and was confirming the understanding against reality. His hands were still. His face was the neutrality, absolute and total, but his eyes were doing something else entirely. 17 years, he said, exactly as he'd said it in the study, but differently now, not to himself, to Aldrich. Aldrich looked at him for a long moment. Then something in the man's constructed competence shifted. Just once, just briefly, a thing moving through his face that might have been, in a different life, in a different room, the beginning of an apology. "You were never supposed to find her," Aldrich said. "That was the miscalculation. Everything else was manageable. She was not supposed to be something that mattered." Cassian said nothing. "I have people in this castle," Aldrich said. The calm of it was the most frightening version of calm she had encountered. "You can take me. You cannot take all of them before tomorrow's session. And tomorrow's session is cancelled," Cassian said. Aldrich stopped. "I sent the cancellation an hour ago," Cassian said, "under royal authority. The king's courier who delivered the original decree is still in the castle. He left with a new document 40 minutes ago." He paused. "There is no session tomorrow. There is no petition. There is no 30-day window." He let that land. "There is only this room, and what you're going to tell me right now about every name in that ledger." The silence in the archive was total, and Aldrich looked at Cassian, the Duke who had inherited him, who had trusted him across 17 years, who had just burned down the entire assembly rather than let the session happen on anyone else's timeline. And for the first time since Evelyn had arrived in Ravencroft Castle, she watched Aldrich calculate a situation and come up empty. "You can't protect her from what comes after this," Aldrich said. His last card. Played flat, without performance. Cassian looked at him. "Watch me," he said. And the ground in the archive under all of them shifted into something that none of them would be able to walk back from. Not Aldrich, not the names in the ledger, not the noble houses sleeping in the rooms above, not Cassian, and not Evelyn, who stood in the cold with the ledger in her hands and understood that the war had just changed shape entirely, and that morning was coming, and that morning was going to be unlike anything Ravencroft had seen in 300 years. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are products of the imagination. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental. Tick. They moved Aldrich to the lower holding room before the archive candles burned another inch. Not the cells. Ravencroft had cells. Old ones, built during a period of his family's history that Cassian had spent 17 years trying to put architectural distance between himself and. The holding room was different. Stone, yes, and cold, and without comfort, but with a table and 2 chairs and the specific quality of a room that was designed for conversation rather than punishment. Cassian needed Aldrich talking, which meant he needed Aldrich calculating rather than despairing. And men in cells despaired because cells communicated finality, and finality closed the mind. He left 2 guards outside the door. Men he had chosen himself in the 60 seconds between the archive and the holding room, men whose names he knew and whose tenure in Ravencroft predated Aldrich's influence over hiring. He had 4 such men. He used all 4. Then he went back to Evelyn. She was in the corridor outside the archive with the ledger still in her hands and the expression of someone who had just run a long distance very fast and had stopped and was now dealing with the fact of having stopped. Not shock. Something past shock. The particular stillness of a mind that has processed something enormous and is deciding what to do with the processing. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." Flat and immediate. Then he threatened me. Not physically. He said there was a version where nobody got hurt, and he preferred that version. He preferred the version where you called for me and I walked into the room without knowing he was there, Cassian said. Yes. She looked at him. You were already coming. I was already coming, he said. The second door. I had been in the passage for 12 minutes before you found the ledger. She processed this. You let me go first. You knew what to look for, he said. I didn't. It was, she understood, the most direct acknowledgement he was constitutionally capable of producing, that there was something in this situation that required her specifically, that his power and his castle and his 17 years of managing both were insufficient for this particular problem without her. He said it as fact, not as vulnerability, but the fact was the vulnerability, and they both understood that. The name's in the ledger, she said. Later, he said. Right now I need to know everything Aldrich said to you before I came through that door. She told him, verbatim, with the precision she applied to things that mattered. He listened without interrupting, which was how he received information that was load-bearing. When she finished, his face had the particular quality she'd learned meant he was restructuring something large. Intelligence work, he said. The garrison gaps, the timing against political events. That's not financial fraud with a side of strategic value. That's the primary function. The money was operational cover. He was quiet for several seconds. Then whoever he was reporting to has been operating in the kingdom's northern strategy for over a decade, he said, using my duchy as a false data point in military and diplomatic calculations. He said this without inflection, which was how he said the things that were most personal. Every alliance decision made on the strength of Ravencroft's defensive position in that period was made on numbers someone was managing, she said. He looked at the corridor wall for a moment. Not at her, not at anything specific. The look of a man doing internal mathematics at speed. The assembly, he said. The cancellation buys us time, not solution. The houses are still in my castle. Aldrich's people are still in my castle. He refocused on her. The ledger names recipients. You read it. Who? She told him the 3 names she'd caught in the 12 minutes before he arrived. He recognized 2 of them instantly. She could tell by the way his face did not change, which was how he communicated recognition of something that should not be recognized, something whose presence in the information was worse than absence would have been. Go to your room, he said. Lock it. Do not open it for anyone except me. I'm not. Evelyn. The way he said her name had changed from the first time he'd used it, which had been in the study weeks ago with the careful neutrality of a man who is managing the temperature of everything. This was different. This was direct, stripped of management, the voice of a man talking to someone who mattered rather than someone who needed handling. 2 of those names have guards in this castle right now who report to them rather than to me. I don't know which guards. I don't know how many. I need you in a locked room while I find out. She looked at him. He held her eyes with the specific directness that was the most honest version of him, and underneath the operational calculation, she could see the thing that was driving it. Not strategy, not the cold architecture of a man protecting a political asset. Something older and simpler and less controlled than anything she'd seen on his face in 6 weeks. All right, she said. She went. The next 3 hours were the longest of Cassian's adult life, and he had lived through hours that had reasonable claims to that title. He worked from his study, alone except for the 2 guards outside the door, using the communications infrastructure of Ravencroft Castle to move information and instruction simultaneously in 6 directions. The castle's loyal staff, the core of them, the ones whose tenure and loyalty he could verify through channels that did not run through Aldrich, were repositioned. The guest quarters were quietly secured from the outside, not imprisoning anyone, but limiting movement through the castle's connecting corridors in ways that could be framed as late-night safety protocol if anyone asked. Nobody asked. The hour was 3 in the morning and the assembly guests were asleep. He pulled the personnel files himself, physically, from the cabinet in his study that had never been administered through the office Aldrich controlled, cross-referenced names against the ledger's recipient list using Evelyn's verbal account. He wished he had the ledger, but she had it, and she was in the East Wing and the East Wing was locked, and that was the correct arrangement. 2 guards. He identified them from the cross-reference in 40 minutes, both in the north wing, both currently posted at locations that he recognized once he saw them mapped, covered the specific corridors connecting the holding room to the castle's external exits. Not a coincidence. Aldrich, even contained, had a contingency running. He sent word to the east wing. Sarah. He'd found the girl in the kitchen corridor at 2 in the morning because apparently Sarah operated on a different schedule from everyone else in Ravencroft, which had seemed incidental before and now seemed like a specific asset. Carried the message. Stay in the room, do not respond to any communication that does not come through Sarah directly. Then he went to deal with the north wing. He did not take additional guards. Taking guards meant choosing guards, and every choice was a calculation he'd have to justify. And justifications at 3 in the morning in a castle full of hostile nobility were liabilities. He went alone, which was a thing the Duke of Ravencroft had not done in a situation involving physical risk since he was 22 years old, and considerably less strategic about his own continued existence. He had changed. He knew that. The man who had stood in this castle 2 months ago, before the seamstress, before the records, before the specific and dismantling education of being seen clearly by someone who had no investment in seeing him as anything other than what he was, that man had not been capable of this particular recklessness, had not had anything generating it. The north wing corridor was cold and lit by wall-mounted candles burning low. He found the first guard at the junction point, exactly where the file said he'd be posted. The man saw him and did the thing that compromised people did when they saw the person they'd betrayed, a half-second of recalibration, of rapidly discarding the prepared story and reaching for a new one. And in that half-second, Cassian had covered the distance between them, and the conversation was over before it started. The second one he found trying to reach the holding room. That took longer. Not much longer, but longer. He came back to his study with a split lip that had come from the wall rather than the guard. Blood drying on his jaw, his coat in a condition that was going to require explanation, and the specific clarity of mind that he'd found every time in his life he'd pushed himself past the point of strategy into the territory of pure physical action came afterward. A stripped-down version of himself. The version that predated the duchy, the title, the 300 years of Blackthorn history sitting on his shoulders. The version that was just a man in a corridor deciding what he was willing to do to protect what mattered. He sat at his desk and breathed for 60 seconds. Then he went back to work. Chab. Dawn came gray over Ravencroft, the light arriving without ceremony, the way it arrived on the coast regardless of what the night had contained. By the time it did, the castle had been restructured, not outwardly. To anyone waking in the guest quarters and performing their morning routine, Ravencroft looked the same. Stone and permanence, and the controlled efficiency of a house that knew what it was. But underneath that surface, the operational reality had been rebuilt from the foundation up, every loyalty rechecked, every position reconfirmed. The 2 compromised guards in custody alongside Aldrich, the communications channels between the castle and the outside world under direct ducal control for the first time since Cassian had inherited a staff from his father without fully examining what he'd inherited. He had not slept. He was in the study when Evelyn arrived, having been let out of the East Wing by Sarah, with the specific air of a woman who had spent several hours locked in a room with her own thoughts, and had reached the end of her patience with both. She stopped when she saw his face. "What happened?" she said. "North Wing," he said. "It's handled." She crossed the room and looked at the split lip with the focused attention she gave to things that concerned her, which was more direct than he was accustomed to receiving. Her hand came up, not quite touching, the gesture stopping an inch short, and he watched her decide whether to close that inch. She closed it. Her fingers against his jaw were careful and warm, and she examined the damage with the practical attention of someone assessing a structural problem, which should not have been as grounding as it was, but the last 6 hours had been conducted in a specific kind of alone that was different from his usual solitude, and the contact of another person's hand was unexpectedly significant. "It'll heal," she said. "Everything does," he said. She looked at him, not at the injury, at him. "The ledger," he said. "I need it. She produced it from somewhere in her clothing, which meant she'd been carrying it against her body through the night, which meant she had understood without being told that carrying it was the safest place for it to be. He took it and opened it and read it properly for the first time. The names ran longer than she'd had time to catch in the archive. 15 recipients across the 11 years, the amounts and dates, and the specific information packages that had been traded for both. The garrison coverage windows, the troop strength reports, the supply capacity assessments, all of them adjusted in the official record to show strength, delivered through Aldrich's secondary channel to show the real numbers. On the last page, which he reached on the second pass-through, was a name he had not expected. Not a recipient, a coordinator. The person who connected Aldrich to the network. The person who had originally approached Aldrich 17 years ago with the proposal that had run underneath everything Cassian had spent his ducal tenure building. He read the name. He read it again. Then he set the ledger down and sat very still for a moment. Evelyn was watching him. She had been watching him the whole time with the attention she gave to things she was worried about, the specific quality of focus that meant she was ready to respond to whatever came next. "Who?" she said. He told her. She went still. "He's in the castle," she said. Not a question. "He arrived with the assembly," Cassian said. "He has been here for 4 days." She sat down, not in the lower chair, in the chair across from him, level, the position she'd claimed on the night the world changed shape. "He's going to know that Aldrich is in custody," she said. "If he doesn't already." "Yes." "Which means he knows the ledger exists." "Yes." "And he'll move before you can use it." "Yes," Cassian said. "He'll move today. Before the assembly formally reconvenes, before I can present the ledger to the king's representative in the castle. He has one window to act, and he knows it, and he's not a man who wastes windows." She looked at him. "What does he look like when he acts?" "I don't know," Cassian said, and the admission was the most exposed thing he'd said in years. "I've known him since I was a child, and I don't know because I was never supposed to know this version of him existed." The fire in the study was low. The morning light through the high windows was still gray. Somewhere in the castle above them, 60 people were waking up to a day they believed was going to be an assembly session, a formal political gathering, the next scene in a drama whose ending they thought they'd already written. They had not written it, but neither had Cassian. Not entirely. Not anymore. "He'll come through the social architecture," she said slowly, thinking aloud, which she rarely did, a sign of speed rather than carelessness. Not physically, not directly. He'll use the assembly structure, call for a formal session, put you in a position where refusing looks like confirmation of wrongdoing. She paused. He needs an audience for what he does next. He needs the other houses watching. "Yes," Cassian said. "Because with an audience, even if I produce the ledger, even if I name him and document everything, it becomes a dispute. My word against his. In front of families who have their own reasons to want me weakened." He paused. "The ledger is physical evidence, but physical evidence requires a framework to operate in, and he will destroy the framework before I can establish it." They sat with this. "Unless," she said. He waited. "Unless the framework comes from somewhere he can't control," she said. "Not from you, not from ducal authority, which he can argue is self-serving, from the assembly itself." She was working through it in real time, her voice taking on the particular quality it had when she was inside an accounting problem, finding the thread. "Meridane," she said. "He knew my father. He reassessed me at dinner. He's not part of the ledger. I read every name. He's not there." She met Cassian's eyes. "He's a man with 11,000 in military levy who has been told his opinions matter since birth. What happens when someone gives him information that makes his opinion the most important in the room?" Cassian looked at her for a moment. "You want to bring Meridane in," he said. "I want you to bring Meridane in," she said. "Tonight, before whatever is coming tomorrow. Show him the ledger. Not the whole thing, let's show the garrison coverage pages. Let him understand what the false data meant for kingdom-wide military strategy, what it meant for his levies, what it cost every house in this assembly that believed Ravencroft's numbers." She held his gaze. "He's not your ally, but he's not your enemy either. He's a man who just found out he's been operating on fraudulent intelligence for a decade. That's a different motivation from political alliance. That's personal. The study was very quiet. You are, Cashin said, in the tone he used when something had resolved into a clarity he hadn't seen coming, extraordinarily good at this. My father taught me, she said. You find the variable that isn't being managed. You build the case from there. He stood up. The decision was already made, had been made somewhere in the 30 seconds after she started talking, while the rest of him caught up. I'll go to Meridane now. One more thing, she said. He stopped. He's going to come for me, she said. Not afraid. Stating it with the flat precision of someone describing an accounting problem. Whoever his people are in this castle, whatever's left of the network after last night, he's going to use me. Because I'm the variable you're not managing through official channels. Because hurting me is the fastest way to make you react instead of think. She held his eyes. I need you to tell me now what I do when that happens. He looked at her for a long moment. The thing he felt was complicated and not entirely comfortable and not entirely unfamiliar. He had felt it in the North Wing corridor at 3 in the morning and in the archive when he'd come through the second door and in the study weeks ago when she had sat down across from him at the same level and refused to be below him in any chair he owned. The feeling of having something he could not manage the loss of being the kind of exposed that his father had warned him against, and his 17 years of careful distance had been specifically designed to prevent. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him, and neither of them moved for a moment, in the way that neither of them had moved in the courtyard when he'd said what he said. The specific gravity of two people who have been circling something and have finally stopped moving around it. You fight, he said, whatever it takes. You do not make it easy for them. And if it gets past that, she said. It won't, he said. Cassian, it won't, he said again. And the second time it was not reassurance. It was a statement about what he was willing to do, about the specific version of himself he'd found in the North Wing corridor and had not lost since, the man who existed when the distance collapsed, and the only thing left was what actually mattered. Because I will be there before it does. She looked at him. You can't promise that, she said. I just did, he said. And she looked at him with the gray-green eyes that had refused to perform fear on the first day in the courtyard, that had read taxation law on a bookshelf while a duke watched from a gallery, that had sat across this desk and found threads in 11-year-old frauds and named them with the quiet precision of a woman who understood that the truth was always findable if you were willing to go far enough into the numbers. She reached up. She put her hand flat against his chest, over the coat that was going to need to be replaced, and held it there. His heartbeat was slower than she'd expected, controlled, in the way everything about him was controlled, but underneath that, present, specific. The heartbeat of a man who was fully in this room and not managing his way through it. Go to Meridane, she said. I'll be here when you get back. He put his hand over hers. 1 second, 2. Then he went. She did not stay in the study. This was a decision she made in the 5 minutes after he left, sitting with the ledger in her lap, and the fire burning low and the specific knowledge that sitting still in a room waiting for something to happen was not who she was and had never been who she was and was not going to start being who she was in the most dangerous morning Ravencroft had seen in 300 years. She went to the records office, not for the files, but for the copies she had made. 3 weeks ago, in the third week of her work in the records office, when she understood that what she was documenting was significant enough to require redundancy. She had copied the primary ledger threads onto a second set of pages in her own hand and filed them under a subject heading that was technically accurate and entirely unremarkable. Northern Route Administrative Review, Quarterly. The kind of file title that no one would pull unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. She pulled it now, folded it, put it inside the front of her dress, flat against her sternum, which was where she'd kept the original ledger through the night. Then she heard the footsteps. Not Sarah's footsteps. She knew Sarah's, had cataloged them without realizing it in the 6 weeks of daily contact, the light efficient pattern of a girl who moved like she was conserving energy. Not guard footsteps. Too singular, too deliberate. The footsteps of a person who had come to this specific room on purpose and was not in a hurry. She turned. Lord Heron Drast stood in the doorway of the records office. He was 63 years old, with the face of a man whose authority had been so total for so long that it had become biological. It sat in the bones, in the way he occupied a doorway, in the quality of his attention, which was the specific attention of a person who had never once in their life walked into a room without already knowing what was in it. She knew the name from the ledger, the last page, the name at the bottom. He looked at her with the specific expression of a man who has come to collect something. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. His voice was extraordinary, warm, certain, the voice of a man who had used it to manage rooms for 40 years. "I was hoping we might speak." She looked at him across the records office, with its reorganized files and its accounting ledgers and its evidence of 6 weeks of her particular skill applied to his particular crime, and felt the cold come up through the floor into her feet and her hands, and the flat place in her chest where the copy of the ledger was pressed against her skin. She did not step back. "Lord Drast," she said. He smiled, the smile of a man who appreciated obstacles in the same way a chess player appreciated an interesting board. He stepped into the room, and behind him, filling the doorway, were 2 men she did not recognize, and the door at the far end of the records office, the secondary door, the one she had noted and said nothing about when she first took the position, swung open from the outside. And Cassian was not here. He was in Meridane's quarters, on the other side of the castle, and he did not know this was happening. And the copy of the ledger was against her skin, and Lord Heron Drast was still smiling, and the morning light through the records office window was gray and getting grayer, and there was nothing in this room that was going to make this easy for them. She thought of what Cassian had said. "You fight, whatever it takes." She looked at Drast. "You should know," she said, her voice level, "that you're already too late." His smile did not change. "Is that so?" "Yes," she said, "because there are 2 copies of everything in that ledger, and you only know where one of them is." The smile held for exactly 3 seconds. Then it didn't. And the records office became the most dangerous room in Ravencroft Castle. And the morning had not yet fully arrived, and Cassian was across the castle, with Meridane and the truth about to break open in all directions at once. And somewhere between this room and that one, everything that had been building for 11 years and 6 weeks simultaneously was about to reach the single point where it either held or it broke. And Eveline Ashcroft, seamstress from Merchant's Row, daughter of a ledger keeper, was standing in the middle of it with her feet flat on the floor and her hands still. This is a work of fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, events, and locations are products of the imagination. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is purely coincidental. She bought herself 4 minutes. Not through strength. She was not going to win a physical confrontation with 2 men blocking exits in a records office. And she understood this with the same clarity she applied to accounting problems. She bought time through the only instrument she had, information and the specific leverage of Drast not knowing how much of it existed and where. She talked. She told him, in the measured tone she used for things that required precision, that the copy against her skin was one of 3, that the third existed outside the castle entirely, that the methodology he'd used to route false garrison data had been documented not just in ledgers but in a written analysis she had prepared and given to a specific person in the castle for safekeeping, and that person was not Cassian. This was partially true. The copy was real, the analysis was real. The third location was not. But Drast did not know what was true and what wasn't, and a man who has spent 11 years managing information understood better than most what it cost to move on incomplete intelligence. He stopped advancing. He stood in the center of the records office with his 2 men behind him, and the secondary door filled and looked at her with the expression of someone recalculating, and in those 4 minutes she did 3 things. She memorized every detail of the room's current configuration with the automatic precision of a mind that had been trained since childhood to notice discrepancy. She moved, incrementally, 2 steps to the left, not retreating, repositioning, putting the heavy oak records cabinet between herself and the secondary door. And she breathed steadily, the way her father had taught her to breathe when numbers didn't add up, and the pressure to panic was high. In through the nose, 4 counts, out through the mouth, because a mind that is breathing correctly can still work. Drast said, "Who?" "I'm not going to tell you that," she said. You understand what happens if you don't cooperate. You're going to do what you came here to do regardless, she said. Cooperation just makes it faster for you. I don't particularly want to make things faster for you. Something in his face shifted. Not the smile this time, something underneath it, the mechanism beneath the performance. The actual man who had built an 11-year intelligence operation and run it through a trusted deputy and had come to a records office at dawn to contain the damage. He was not, she recognized, a man who enjoyed this. He was a man who was doing what he had calculated was necessary, which was a different and in some ways more dangerous thing. The Duke trusts you, Drass said. Not accusation. Observation, in the way he'd made every statement, assessing rather than attacking. That is genuinely unfortunate. For both of you. He trusted Aldrich for 17 years, she said. He survived that. Aldrich was useful, Drass said. Useful people are preserved when possible. You are... He paused, selecting the word with the care of a man who had always chosen words carefully. Inconvenient. She looked at him across the records office in the gray morning light and felt the cold in her hands and the flat weight of the copy against her sternum and thought, with the specific focus of a mind that was working because it had to. Where is the thread? There is always a thread. Every system has one variable that is not being managed. She found it in the second she looked at Drast's face. He was afraid. Not of her. Of the morning. Of what the ledger meant, and what Meridane's military levy meant, and what the king's courier still somewhere in this castle meant, and the specific fear of a man who has run something sophisticated for 11 years and is watching it collapse faster than he calculated, because one variable, the seamstress, the ledger keeper's daughter, the woman who did laundry to listen, had been outside his model entirely. People make mistakes when they're afraid. She needed him to make one. You coordinated this across 17 years, she said, through Aldrich, through Garrison Data, through a network that touched 15 recipients. She kept her voice even, informational. That's not ambition. That's a career. You built something as real as this castle, just underneath it. She held his eyes. Who were you doing it for? He looked at her. Because it wasn't for yourself, she said. The recipient list doesn't include you. You were a coordinator, not a beneficiary. Someone owned this operation and it wasn't you. She paused. Who were you loyal to? The room was very quiet, and Drast looked at her with something moving in his face that was not the calculation she'd been reading for the past 4 minutes. Something older than calculation. The expression of a man who has spent decades doing a thing in service of something he believed in and has just been asked, perhaps for the first time, to name it out loud to someone who is genuinely asking. The secondary door opened wider. The guard in it moved forward 1 step. And the main door of the records office, the one behind Drast, the one she'd come in through, came off its hinges. Not broke open. Came off its hinges in the specific controlled way of something struck with force, applied by a person who understood the mechanical weak point of a door and had hit it there on purpose. And Cassian Blackthorne stepped through the gap, with Lord Meridane directly behind him, and 2 men she did not recognize behind Meridane who had the specific physical presence of the military levy's personal guard. Drast turned. The room contained 6 people and the accumulated weight of 11 years and everything that had built to this moment, and it was very small for all of it. Heron, Cassian said. 1 word. The name alone. No title, no formality, the specific intimacy of a man speaking to someone he has known since childhood with the knowledge of what that person actually is sitting in the word like a stone in water. Drast looked at him, and the performance fell. Not dramatically, not with collapse or theatrics, the way a structure falls when the load-bearing element is removed, sudden, complete, irreversible. The warmth went out of his face, and what was left was the real version, which was tired. Extraordinarily tired, in the way that men who have carried something heavy for a very long time look tired when they finally set it down. You should have married one of them, Drast said. Any of them. It would have been simpler. I know, Cassian said. He had not moved from the doorway. For you, specifically. Something moved through Drast's face at that. The marriage consolidates the Northern Alliance, strengthens the position, makes Ravencroft less, He stopped. Less what? Cassian said. Singular, Drast said. You have been singular for 17 years. One man's vision, one man's judgment. That is not stability. That is a single point of failure. He said this with the conviction of someone quoting a belief they'd held for a long time, not a rationalization. I built what I built because this duchy, under a singular ruler with no binding alliances and no political anchor, was a vulnerability in the kingdom's northern architecture. I was trying to compensate for it. Meridane, behind Cassian, made a sound that was not quite a word. By falsifying the garrison data, Cassian said. By making the vulnerability legible to people who could act on it strategically, Drast said. If Ravencroft fell, it needed to fall in a direction that was controlled. The recipients of that information were positioned to move assets in response. They were positioned to profit, Meridane said from behind Cassian. His voice had the specific quality of a man controlling fury with the physical effort that fury required. My levy, my men's deployment calculations, for a decade based on numbers you managed. He stepped forward. You will tell me every name on that list before this day ends. Drast looked at Meridane, then back at Cassian, and something in the last of his calculation resolved into the exhausted simplicity of a man out of moves. Yes, he said. I will. But it ended not with violence, but with documentation, which was perhaps appropriate given what had started it. Drast was escorted to the same holding room as Aldrich. His 2 men were taken by Meridane's guards. The secondary door was secured. The assembly, still largely unaware of what the night had contained, was formally notified through the castle's communication channels that the session convening that morning would instead proceed as an extraordinary administrative review under ducal and royal authority, and that attendance was required. Meridane handled the announcement himself. This had been Cassian's request, and Meridane had agreed with the specific satisfaction of a man who had been handed an opportunity to be the most important person in a room and understood both the gift and its purpose. Cassian found Evelyn still in the records office. She was sitting on the floor next to the oak cabinet, which she had apparently reached at some point during the 4 minutes and decided to stay beside. She had her knees up and her back against the wood and the copy of the ledger in her lap, and she was looking at the wall with the expression of a person whose body had decided that the crisis was finished and was now presenting the bill for the adrenaline. He crossed the room and sat down on the floor next to her. This was not something he had done in this castle before. The Duke of Ravencroft did not sit on floors. He sat at desks and in chairs designed to communicate authority, and he stood at windows and in courtyards, and the entire physical grammar of his existence in this building had been constructed around the principle that position communicated power. He sat on the floor of the records office and felt the cold stone through his coat and did not move. After a moment she said, "You came back. I told you I would. You couldn't have known." "No," he said. "Meridane told me. He had a man watching Drast from the moment I showed him the ledger, because Meridane is a man who watches people he doesn't trust, and he has never trusted Drast." He paused. "I didn't know it was the records office until 8 minutes ago." She absorbed this. 8 minutes. "I ran," he said, in the flat tone of a man reporting a fact that was also, in its way, a confession. The Duke of Ravencroft, running through his own castle corridors at dawn because something mattered enough to run for. She turned her head and looked at him. The gray morning light came through the high window at an angle that showed the split lip, the dried blood on his jaw, the coat that had not improved since she'd last seen it, and the expression on his face that was the same one she'd been learning to read for 6 weeks, the unguarded one, the one that appeared when he had stopped managing and was just present. "Drast," she said, "what happens to him?" "The king's representative will convene a formal proceeding," he said. "The ledger is primary evidence. Your documentation is the foundation of the case. Meridane's testimony covers the military impact. The recipients will be investigated individually." He paused. "It will take months. It will be complicated. The political fallout will be significant." "But it will hold," she said. "Yes," he said, "it will hold." She looked back at the wall. He watched her breathing. The slow return to normal after the body's emergency system stood down. The specific rhythm of someone who had been afraid and had not let the fear make their decisions. He had watched her in that room for the 40 seconds before Meridane's men came through the secondary door. Had watched her stand in front of Drast with her feet flat and her hands still and talk. Not beg, not threaten, not perform any of the things that people performed when they were cornered. She had talked to Drast the way she talked to everything that needed to be understood before it could be addressed, with the focused attention of a woman who believed that the truth was always findable if you were willing to go far enough into it. She had been buying time, he understood that. But in buying it, she had also done something else, had asked Drast, in the middle of the most dangerous 4 minutes of her life, who he had been loyal to. And Drast had almost answered, because she had asked like she actually wanted to know, and people responded to genuine questions differently from tactical ones, and she had known that because she understood people the way she understood numbers, as systems that followed their own logic if you found the right entry point. He had inherited this duchy at 19 and spent 17 years building it, and had never once thought to sit on its floor. "Evelyn?" he said. She turned her head again. "The petition is voided," he said. "The Assembly's authority over ducal decisions does not survive what Drast's network was doing in its shadow. Meridane will see to that, because it serves his interests and it also happens to be correct." He paused. "The political argument for the marital alliance collapses with the petition." She was quiet for a moment. "I know." "Which means," he said, "that nothing I do next is compelled. Not by the petition, not by the Assembly, not by the 30-day window or the Kingdom Review or any other mechanism that someone built to force a particular outcome." She looked at him steadily. "I know that too. What I said in the courtyard," he said, "the night before the response went out, about my intentions." He held her eyes with the specific directness that was the only version of himself he entirely trusted, the unmanaged one, the one that had run through corridors and sat on stone floors. That was not political. It was not strategic. I have been political and strategic for 17 years, and I know the difference between a decision made from calculation and a decision made from something else. He paused. "This is something else." The morning light in the records office had shifted while they sat there, the gray resolving slowly, incrementally, into the particular northern light that came off the sea in winter, thin and clear and without sentiment. She said, "You should know that I am going to be very difficult." He looked at her. "As a person," she said, "in this position, whatever this position is." She said it without apology, with the flat practicality she applied to things that were true. "I'm not going to learn to be something I'm not for a dining hall full of people who look at me the way Lady Corvin looked at me the first time we spoke. I'm going to continue to say things that made Aldrich do that thing with his expression." She stopped. "I'm going to find every accounting discrepancy in this duchy, and I am not going to stop finding them just because finding them causes political difficulty, and I am going to sit in chairs at the same height as the desk, and I'm going to tell you when I think you're wrong." "I know," he said. "You don't mind that." "I mind being wrong more than I mind being told," he said. "You correct the more important problem." Something shifted in her face. The thing he had seen exactly once before, on the first day in the study, the unwilling amusement quickly controlled, except this time it was not quickly controlled. This time she let it through, and it changed her face into something that was not the precise focused version he'd been reading for 6 weeks, but something warmer and more unguarded and entirely her own. He put his hand on the floor between them. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put hers over it. "Okay." The formal proceeding convened at midday. The Great Hall had been prepared differently from the assembly dinners. No theatrical silverware, no hierarchy of seating designed to communicate social architecture. Tables arranged in a practical configuration, documentation laid out, Meridane presiding alongside the king's representative, with the specific authority of a man who has recently discovered he's been operating on fraudulent intelligence for a decade, and has decided that finding out exactly how extensive it was is now his primary professional purpose. Cashin sat at the head of the arrangement and said very little for most of the proceeding. He had learned, across 36 years, and specifically across the last 6 weeks, that the most powerful position in a room was not always the loudest one. That silence used correctly was not absence but presence. the presence of a person who had already decided and was waiting for the room to catch up. That the architecture of authority was not built in a single demonstration, but in the accumulated weight of choices made consistently over time, each one load-bearing, each one part of a structure that outlasted any individual conflict. What had he been made of before the seamstress came through his gates? He turned this over while Meridane's voice filled the hall, and the names in the ledger were entered into the formal record, and the 15 recipients of 11 years of manufactured intelligence began the process of discovering what accountability looked like when it arrived from multiple directions simultaneously. He had been made of the right things, he thought, the right foundations. The principle that power exercised without purpose was just waste, and that a duchy was a living system requiring maintenance rather than a monument requiring admiration. But he had been running that system with a crack in the load-bearing structure that he hadn't found because he hadn't looked, because looking required a kind of vulnerability he'd spent 17 years designing out of his operational approach. The willingness to not know, to admit the gap, to bring in something from outside his own competence and let it work. Evelyn sat 3 seats to his right, not beside him, not yet, not in a formal proceeding where the shape of what they were to each other was still new and not yet publicly articulated beyond the response that had named her. 3 seats, visible, present, a position she had taken without being assigned it and which communicated in the specific language of room configuration, something that every person in the hall was reading in their own way. He read it as, here. She was here, in the formal proceeding, with the ledger copy in front of her, and her posture the same posture she'd had in his study on the first day. Weight balanced, space occupied deliberately, the physical language of a woman who had decided how much room she was taking and had no intention of negotiating it downward. When her name was called to present her documentation, she stood up and did it in the flat, precise voice she used for things that mattered. And the hall listened, the way halls listen to people who were clearly not performing, with the specific attention given to something real in a context full of constructed things. Afterward, Lord Meridane looked at her from his position at the table and said, in a voice that carried, "Your father kept good records." She looked at him. "He did." "So do you," Meridane said, and returned to the proceeding. The assembly dispersed over the following 2 days. Not in defeat, or not all of them. The politics of the thing were complicated in the way that situations involving 17 years of covert intelligence operation were always complicated, and the fallout would run through the kingdom's northern strategy for months. While the formal investigation processed the ledger against the recipient list, against the garrison data, against the kingdom-wide military deployments that had been made on false numbers. But they dispersed. The Voreth family left on the first morning after the proceeding, with the specific efficiency of people who have assessed a situation and determined that their original strategic purpose no longer applies. Lady Marin did not speak to Evelyn before she left, but she looked at her once in the main corridor on the way to the courtyard. A long, clear look, without the performance, without the careful beauty deployed as argument. Just a woman looking at another woman who had won something that neither of them had entirely understood was a contest until it was over. Evelyn looked back. Meridane left last. He shook Cassian's hand in the courtyard with the grip of a man who was recalibrating a 17-year assessment and finding the new calculation more interesting than the old one. "The girl is good," he said. Not quite an apology, not quite a compliment. Something in between, from a man who did not deal in either directly. "I know," Cassian said. "She'll cause you trouble." "Yes," he said. Consistently. Meridane looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has been told his opinions matter since birth, and is encountering, perhaps for the first time, a version of happiness that does not look like he expected happiness to look. "Good," Meridane said, and climbed into his carriage. But the evening after the last carriage cleared the Ravencroft gates, the castle returned to itself. Not the version of itself it had been before. That version had contained Aldrich, had been running on false foundations, had been a structure more compromised than Cassian had known. But the essential thing, the thing carved from cliff-face stone by people who had decided that this particular stretch of northern coast was worth defending and had spent 300 years proving it, that remained. Clarified, maybe. stripped of the accumulated weight of what had been hidden inside it. He found Evelyn on the North Tower. She had discovered it 2 weeks into her stay and had mentioned it to no one, which he knew because Sarah had told him, with the air of someone sharing information that seemed significant without knowing exactly why. The highest point of the castle, the place where the wind came off the sea without anything intervening, and the cliff below was a straight drop to water that was never the same color twice. She was standing at the parapet with her hands on the stone and her hair destroyed by the wind and her expression the one he'd seen on the first morning in the courtyard, the one that wasn't performing anything, just a person in a large space, present in it. He stood beside her without announcement, which was how he went most places, and they stood together in the wind for a while without speaking, because the situation did not require speech, and they had both, across the last 6 weeks, become people who understood that about each other. Below, the sea was the color of pewter, going silver at the edges where the evening light caught it. "Aldrich will be tried," she said eventually. Not a question. "Yes." "Drast too." "Yes." "And Thomas," she said. "My brother. The knee." He had not forgotten. The compartment where he kept certain pieces of information was very full now, organized differently from the way he'd organized it before, less separate from the machinery of daily decision-making, more integrated, the way a structural repair becomes part of the original building rather than a visible addition. "There's a physician in the capital," he said. "Specific work in joint damage. I've sent correspondence." He paused. "He will come to Thornmere. Or Thomas comes here. Your choice. His choice." She was quiet for a moment. "You did that before today," she said. 3 weeks ago," he said. She looked at the sea. He watched her from his peripheral vision, the specific way she absorbed things that mattered, not with dramatic response, but with a stillness that was the opposite of blankness, a stillness full of something processing. "I don't know how to do this," she said. Her voice was different at this elevation, in this wind, stripped of the professional precision she used in working rooms, closer to the actual register of her. "Whatever this is, I know how to find a thread in a 17-year accounting fraud, and I know how to talk to Lord Drast for 4 minutes in a dangerous room, and I know how to sit in a chair at the right height." She paused. "I don't know how to be a duchess." "Neither did I," he said. "Know how to be a duke. When I was 19 and my father died and everyone in the castle was measuring what they could take." He looked at the sea alongside her. "I learned, not by knowing in advance, by doing the work and getting some of it wrong and finding out what I was actually made of when something put pressure on it." "That's not particularly reassuring," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's true, though." She looked at him. The wind was doing something to her hair that she appeared to have decided was not her problem. "I told you in the study," she said. "I'm going to be difficult." "You told me," he said. "I agreed." "You agreed very easily." "Because difficult means present," he said. "Means engaged. Means you give enough of a damn to push back." He looked at her. "I spent 17 years building something that nobody inside pushed back against because the person I trusted most to do it was—" He stopped, said it plainly, "was Aldrich, who had his own purposes." He paused. "I want difficult. I want someone in this castle who is not trying to manage me." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right." 2 words. In her voice, in the wind, with the sea below and the castle around them, and 300 years of blackthorn stone under their feet. It was the least dramatic version of a thing that was, underneath, enormous. The way the most significant structural decisions were always the least dramatic ones, made quietly, in the full understanding of what they cost and what they built, without performance or ceremony, just the weight of 2 people choosing in a way that couldn't be walked back. He reached out. He tucked a piece of her hair back from her face carefully, with the specific care he applied to things that mattered. And she let him, looking at him while he did it with the gray-green eyes that had refused to perform fear on the first day, and had read taxation law on his shelves, and had held Lord Drast's gaze in a dangerous room for 4 minutes, and had looked at him, across 6 weeks of desks and corridors, and stone floors and assembly dinners, with the particular attention of someone who has seen the actual person rather than the position. He left his hand against her face for a moment. She put hers over it. "You should know," he said quietly in the wind, "that I have never once in my life done something like this." "Like what?" she said. "Like any of it," he said. "The courtyard, the response, the floor of the records office." He paused. "I have been the Duke of Ravencroft for 17 years, and I have never once sat on a floor." Something happened in her face. "You should do it more often." "Possibly," he said, "with better timing." And she laughed. A real one. The kind that had no preparation, that came from somewhere genuine and surprised. In the wind on the north tower with the sea below and the evening arriving over the cliff face from the east. And it was not beautiful in any constructed way. It was just hers, and he held it the way he held everything that mattered now. Without distance, without management, with the full weight of his attention. The kingdom spread out below them in all directions. Not his entirely. Not anymore. Or not only. Something more complicated and more interesting than ownership. A ducky that had been hollowed and had been found and had been rebuilt from the inside, starting from the records, starting from the truth, starting from the precise moment a seamstress had walked into a courtyard and looked up at a gallery without performing the fear she was supposed to feel. Cassian Blackthorne looked at what he had and what he had nearly lost and what he had chosen, and felt, for the first time in 17 years, the specific sensation of a man whose foundations were solid all the way down. Not because he controlled everything, because he finally knew what was worth controlling for. The sea caught the last of the evening light and held it briefly before the dark came in from the north the way it always came, completely, without negotiation, settling over Ravencroft the way it settled over everything on this coast, indifferent to what the day had contained. The castle held. It had always held. Now it knew why.